And warmer from the low, welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you as we're going to be joined in a few minutes by Tristan Freeman. He does great work over at Bussin' Brackets, taking a look at this great game of college basketball that we all know and love all 12 months out of the season, and we're going to be chatting with him just about what we can expect this offseason in terms of some of these big men, whether or not there's going to be as big of a premium on them as there was in the last offseason, because we did see a lot of these guys that were signed for big money, like looking at you, Gredos Abor, Umar Ballo, that they did not necessarily pan out, so we'll be diving in on that front. Additionally, we're going to be taking a look at just what we saw this past season in terms of the top heaviness of college basketball. If that's going to be a sign of things to come, we'll talk a little bit about the ACC with them as well. And then in the final segment, I'm going to give you a roundup as to all the news and notes that we saw in college basketball over the last 24 hours. If you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one or two ways we fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at Juden_81. Keep in mind, letters DM, they mean does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. Then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. Did not get in any Twitter/X questions today, but something that did stand out to me was the situation that happened with Robert Wright. He was over at Baylor this last season. Seems as though Baylor was trying to give him $1 million in NIL. He was signed to a contract, and all of a sudden, that contract went into the abyss. He is now going to be playing for BYU this upcoming season, and they apparently are going to be giving him in the neighborhood of $3 million, according to some reports. And this is something that you do want to be mindful of during the offseason. You want to be double checking and triple checking these rosters, because you think that a guy is signed one place and they go a complete other place. This is certainly something that you want to be doing in terms of these guys that are going to be in the transfer portal as well, along with the NBA draft, because some of those NBA draft decisions are interesting, and some of those guys that enter into the NBA draft, sometimes they decide not to go back to school, but they don't stay in the NBA draft. They play overseas, something of that nature. We get a few of those guys every single year, especially the international men of mystery, so do be mindful of that as well. So that is something that stands out to me, and I'll try to give you guys 3 segments on these podcasts. There will be some 2-segment podcasts as well. These first segments, as you can tell, they're a little bit shorter because they're a little bit more to the point. This is typically where I do air out those questions, and I'm sure that most of you are taking a little bit of a hiatus from college basketball because the season just ended a few days ago. But if you have a question at any point, whether that be tomorrow, whether that be a week from now, a month from now, 3 months from now, leading up to the start of the season, this first segment, it'll always be here for you, and I'm always happy to air those out, so do leave those there. But certainly did think that was interesting what happened with Mr. Wright, and it's always great to be able to get Mr. Tristan Freeman aboard. We'll chat with him next right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now a part of the VSiN Family Podcast, which is all presented by Edge Boost. Edge Boost is making sure that bettors are able to get money in their account, and they're able to access it 24/7, 365, because it is an account. It's not utilizing credit or anything like that. When you go to edgeboost.bet, utilize the promo code of Greg, G-R-E-G, your first $25 deposit, it's going to be matched dollar for dollar, and you earn cashback rewards as you use Edge Boost. That's over at edgeboost.bet, promo code G-R-E-G, and Tristan comes up next right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now a part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Always great to be joined by this man as we've got Tristan Freeman aboard. He does such amazing work over at Bussin' Brackets, taking a look at this great game of basketball all 12 months out of the year. He does a really good job of being able to keep up with everything that we're seeing here in the offseason, all these coaching moves, all that we're going to be getting in terms of the 100 million guys in the transfer portal. He does an amazing job of being able to keep up with it all. You're able to find him on the old Twitter/X at HoopsNut351 as he does great work with Bussin' Brackets, but along with that, the Field of 68. He's been doing some work with Sleepers Media as well, and always do appreciate it, my friend. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Greg. Appreciate it.
I appreciate you. And before we look forward to the offseason, how about if we do take a look at what we got this past year? Because it was a very top-heavy year. I know that the biggest gripes for many people is the fact that we didn't get a lot of those upsets that we always love to see in the NCAA tournament. And my main question for you is, do you think that this was a little bit of a one-off year, or do you think that this is a little bit more of a sign of things to come?
Yeah, I think it was more of a one-off year. I think people have to remember that we're still in the COVID era in terms of scholarships. So there were a ton of fifth-year seniors out there, including Final Four with guys like Janai Broom and Walter Clayton. Once a lot of these fifth and fourth-year seniors are gone, the talent level is going to go down, and we're seeing that a bit in the transfer portal where there aren't necessarily a ton of stars in there. So I think that the top heavy teams will go down a notch, and some of the mid majors will have a better chance. But ultimately, I just thought it was a great tournament where a lot of quality play happened, and the best teams won. We ended up having great basketball in San Antonio.
Yeah, we did have an absolutely amazing Final Four and national title game. And I mean, the theme of it all was comebacks. And how much did you make out of the fact that it was very difficult for teams to be able to maintain a lead, not just in the NCAA tournament, but I felt like that was a hallmark all season long. I feel like because I do a lot in terms of betting side of things, as you know, that there were just more blown leads this year than I can ever remember. Do you chalk that up to a little bit more to the level of talent on the other side, where in the NBA you get a game of runs, and now we're seeing that a little bit more in college basketball, or just something else in general? Because that was a big takeaway that I had from this past season.
They got a lot of great coaches in the Final Four as well. So, there was a lot of adjustments and a lot of schemes going on to where, a 10-point leads weren't safe. And it's interesting because, there weren't a lot of freshmen in the Final Four either outside of Duke, but even the veteran teams like Houston and Auburn, sort of have their issues as well. So I do think, as we've seen in the NBA, where there's so much talent that, 10-point leads are not doom anymore. If you get a good 3-minute span, you can just come back. And it's a good thing overall for the game. And we'll see how it goes once, teams aren't as old anymore, but I definitely think that played into it this time around.
Yeah, it certainly was interesting to just watch a gameplay in general all season long, as our good friend Tristan Freeman, who does great work over at Boston Brackets, he is joining me right here on Cuss Cuss Hoops. And now that we have tied a bow around what we saw this past season, how about if we take a look at what we've gotten this offseason? Because already 55 teams have committed to making a coaching change. I believe all but 7 of those vacancies have been filled. Obviously, we're waiting on Denver, Texas A&M, a few of those. But just what have you made out of the coaching cycle this offseason? Because I remember that post-COVID, that first year out of COVID, the 2020 season, we weren't seeing a lot of coaching changes. And I still think that there might be a few residual effects around this. And then the obvious case of NIL impacting this as well. I think it's making for a little bit of a double whammy, and why we've seen so much movement here this offseason with these coaches.
Yeah, I mean, it still wasn't necessarily as crazy as a year ago, where a lot of, big names ended up moving around. But there were definitely, a good amount of coaches who are on the hot seat who changes are going to be had. And we're seeing, these days, coaches are not given, 3-4 years. If you don't have a competitive roster by year 3, then teams are going to
sometimes year 2.
Yeah. Yeah, in some cases, as far as year 1, if it's been a disaster. But I definitely think with the resources, with NIL and revenue sharing, there's now, technically fewer excuses. But with it happening now for everyone, the playing field is still going to be somewhat even. And I also think that, coaches are more willing to jump now to different spots. If you're on the hot seat, you either, find another spot, or Buzz Williams, situation, you're just going to leave after a few years anyway to just start over. So it's definitely interesting to see, all the teams that made decisions, but there's still probably a good 8 to 10 coaches I think everyone can agree on that's going to be on the hot seat next season, including several alone in the ACC. So we'll be back at it a year from now, especially in that league.
Yep, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought that up with the ACC as well, because it's becoming an arms race in terms of being able to have NIL dollars. I know that just in talking with Rocco Miller, one of our good mutual friends, he talks about how the 10th guy in the SEC is getting paid more than the top guy at insert your favorite Mountain West school here, which I think is so interesting. And just how is the ACC trying to combat the fact that, let's call it what it is, they've fallen a little bit in the pecking order sans Duke in college basketball. We've seen them get passed by the Big Ten. We've seen them get passed by the Big 12, SEC, what have you. And it does feel like there's a little bit more of an effort for these ACC schools to be able to build up a little bit more prominence. And I do think that there have been some nice offseason moves being made, with Miami certainly sticking a lot of NIL dollars into what they're going to be able to build for this upcoming season, and the move of Virginia bringing in Ryan Odom and him already bringing in some top flight guys.
Yeah, and then NC State bringing in Will Wade, who many people are fans of. That's obviously viewed as a good hire. it'll be interesting to see what Jai Lucas does over at Miami because obviously resources won't be an issue, but we'll see what kind of roster he ultimately builds up with the few pieces he's already had. I do think it'll be interesting to see what the ACC does with revenue sharing because obviously they're not going to have the same kind of resources as the SEC. But at the same time, some of the more football heavy conferences like the SEC and Big Ten, they're still going to have to divert a lot of resources to football, whereas maybe it's an opportunity for some of these teams who aren't necessarily going to have title contenders on the gridiron to sort of push themselves forward on the basketball level. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of players they get in the offseason. I think so far, the SEC once again leads when it comes to the type of quality portal pickups. But, ACC is still getting some pieces. You see, North Carolina sort of filling out its front court so far and other teams making moves. It's interesting to see what happens, but it does help when, the big faces, Duke, UNC, and Louisville having, a solid offseason so far.
Yep, and for Louisville, it does feel like things are just getting right back on track for them as well. And how big was it the way that they were able to end this last season? Recognize that in the NCAA tournament, not necessarily what they wanted, but towards back half of the ACC season, they were able to really build themselves back up. And certainly in the ACC, I think that we both agree, having a little bit more depth with these schools like Boston College and teams like that at the bottom, that's going to be paramount for them being able to get back to prominence. But I feel like Louisville, who was just a drag when they were in the old regime, to say the least, them being able to rise back up, I thought was a very good sign for an ACC that there's been a lot of flack that has been thrown that conference's way, but it does feel like there is a little bit of upside with that program under Pat Kelsey.
Yeah, and look, if nothing else, even though they didn't advance in the tournament, going winning 27 games and then going 18-2 and going basically step for step with Duke for the ACC title is a massive first year for Kelsey. And obviously, they're going to have the resources. They've had a great offseason so far, landing three of the top players in the portal in offseason, including Isaac McNeely from Virginia. So it's been a great start for them, and they're already going to have a roster that's going to be top 25 good. And, we'll see if they can take the leap. And even if they can't, if nothing else, that they're back to being nationally competitive, which is just complete opposite of what they were in the past couple of years in the previous regime with Kenny Payne.
Yeah, the pain train, well, that was a lot of pain for Louisville fans, and certainly they are a ways away from that. As joining me on the show, we do have Tristan Freeman, who does such great work over at Boston Brackets, joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, and this is something I've been talking about on my podcast the last few days. I think that when it comes to the transfer portal in this day and age, it's not news when a guy enters into the transfer portal, it's news when a guy actually returns. I don't know if you agree/disagree, but I think that when it's all said and done, we're going to have more guys that actually enter into the transfer portal that don't enter into the transfer portal. And I do think that when it comes to roster building, what have you, it should be viewed as a little bit more of a surprise if you get more than 35% of your minutes back, because I just look at all these guys in the portal right now, and I can't recognize darn near any of these teams that we saw from a season ago right now.
Guys who are on limited roles are going to want to see if they can find something better. Guys who had really good years are going to see what their value is on the open market. So there aren't necessarily going to be a lot of guys who feel incentivized to just simply stay. And that includes especially for mid-major players who are all elite guys who can easily move up and get more money. So, yeah, guys who do stay is definitely a surprise, but you still want to have some kind of continuity with your roster because as we've seen with many teams, including, Kansas State and USC, having 10 newcomers, it's going to take you a long time to figure out what the right rotations are. And by then, some of those teams are already going to be out of postseason contention.
And how big do you think that it is in this day and age to try to perhaps find these guys in the transfer portal that they save for multiple years? Because I thought that was a big theme with the teams that made the Final Four this year. Like with Houston, they brought in a guy like an L.J. Cryer, but L.J. Cryer is a guy that was there for multiple years after transferring on over to Baylor. Walter Clayton was a guy that began at Iona, but he spent multiple years at Florida. I think that that's really been a blueprint for these teams that have been able to make Final Four and title runs. They utilize the transfer portal, but they utilize the transfer portal not for one-year rental guys, but for guys that are going to be a part of that program for 2-3 years. And I mean, going back to the UConn teams that won back-to-back titles, they were very much built around that as well.
Yeah, sure. You'd like to have guys for multiple years, but ultimately guys are going to be 1 year rentals if they want to be. I mean, Keyshawn Hall is going to be on 4 teams in 4 years. I'm sure UCF would have liked to have him for multiple years, but that didn't work. And that's just going to be the case for other situations. You're going to have to be a good enough team for the players to want to come back. And that's easier said than done because ultimately there's only going to be 25 ranked teams and everyone else, is going to have to rebuild a bit.
Yep, no question about it. It's going to be so interesting to see what we get this offseason. And I know that there's been a lot made out of the fact that there were a lot of guys that were wanting to sign early because I know that there's going to be like changes that is going to be happening with these NIL collectives here in this offseason, what have you. And how big do you think that it was that a lot of these teams were able to sign guys prior to the Nets getting cut down in San Antonio this week? Because in past off seasons, a lot of the signings, they start to happen right now, but it feels like really the start of the offseason happened about a week or two ago. Like right when guys entered in the portal, they were signed within like 72, 96 hours of entering into the transfer portal. And that's something that we haven't seen as much in past off seasons. And it does feel like teams really did prioritize trying to be able to get a few guys on the books right away this off season.
Yeah, and it works for multiple reasons. One, if you're a team, you want to fill out your roster. You don't want to head into May with 6 or 7 open spots having to fill and scramble. And players, if you're looking for top dollar, not every team is going to have, $2 million to pay. So if a team's willing to offer that early and that's what you want, you better get it now before someone else does. So it's mutually beneficial to sort of get as many signs as possible. And now some of these teams, they know where they stand already and they can find specific holes. Then there are others who, again, they just may have some funds, but they're going to have to start spreading it out because they have a lot of roster spots to fill.
Yep, it certainly is going to be interesting to see what we get this offseason. And I think that's just way too early to tell as to what we're going to be getting in the transfer portal right now because, as I mentioned, there's north of 2,000 guys that are going to be in there. But what do you think might be a little bit of a theme as to what some of these teams are going to be prioritizing in the offseason? And I recognize that that's a tough question to answer because there are some teams that are going to be looking more for big men. There are going to be some teams that are going to be looking to be able to build a little bit of camaraderie. Like, I think that Seth Trimble returning to North Carolina, that's going to be big in general. But do you think that there might be a little bit of a theme that develops this offseason? Because I just still remember the last few off seasons, it felt like big men were treated like gold in the transfer portal because there just weren't necessarily a ton of them. And we saw a lot of those big man signings, like look no further than Grado Sabor. They just didn't seem to pan out this past cycle.
Yeah, I mean, there were plenty of teams who, even though they got big, still had front court issues. Obviously, North Carolina was a big example of that. They had Tyshawn Claude and Ben Allen Lubin, and it still didn't work out for them. So obviously, bigs will be a premium. Teams are obviously going to want shooting. If there are guys who shot 45% from deep, Hunter Huff is a good example of that. He's had plenty of interest. Teams are going to want them. You can never have enough shooting, and you can never have enough physical big men on your roster.
No doubt about it. There's going to be a lot to take a look at this offseason, Tristan. I know you're trying to decipher it all. A lot of people think that the work is done when the nets are cut down and the Final Four is all wrapped up. No, sir. The teams that are going to be back in the NCAA tournament in March, they're building up those rosters right now. You're doing a great job of keeping your finger on the pulse of it. Also, let the good people at home know it's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Yeah, you can follow me at Hoopstud351 on Twitter and X, and I'll be doing articles for Field 68, Hoops HQ, and obviously Bustin' Brackets. And we're just fully into transfer portal season and doing some way too early projections for next season throughout the leagues for those who are interested in that.
No doubt about it. And Tristan, he does such an amazing job taking a look at this wonderful game of basketball, and every single time he joins me, lots of great insight. So big thanks to Tristan for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And coming up next, I give you guys a recap of all the news and notes that we saw in college basketball on Thursday. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Always great to be joined by Tristan Freeman, who does such amazing work over at Bustin' Brackets, taking a look at this great game of college basketball all 12 months out of the year. He's very hard at work getting everything that we are taking a look at in terms of the transfer portal, all these coaching changes, so much more. He's on top of it all 12 months out of the year, so Big thanks to Tristan for joining me in the last segment. Now it is that time of the podcast. I give you a recap of the news and notes that we saw in college basketball over the last 24 hours. The biggest piece of news is the fact that Robert Wright, who last year he was over at Baylor, and he was rock solid while he was over at Baylor last season. He started most of their games, 11.5 points, 4 assists per contest, mid to high 30s, 3-point shooter, was a 5-star recruit. He was looking like he was going to be going back to Baylor. They were going to pay him more than $1 million, but it appears as though BYU is swept in, and according to Jeff Goodman over at the Field of 68, who's one of the best follows this time of year because he does a great job being able to keep his finger on the pulse of everything that's happening with regards to these coaching moves, the transfer portal, what have you. Apparently BYU is going to pay him about $3 million, and he's going to be heading on over there. So that's very interesting to say the least for BYU. No question about it. This has been a very rambunctious offseason for them. They were able to sign the number 1 recruit in AJ DeBansta. Hopefully I said that correctly. I'm sure that I'm going to be getting to know his name when it's all said and done. They're going to be bringing him in as they utilize their big NIL bag to be able to do that. Now they're going to be able to pair Mr. Wright up with him as well. This team is really starting to build something. They do lose a few guys here in the offseason, like Dallin Hall decided to leave the program, but the pockets are very, very deep over there at BYU, and they're utilizing it to try to be able to build themselves up as much as humanly possible. So we will see if we're going to be getting a little bit more there. We are getting a few D2 guys that are stepping up to the Division I level. Dimitri Gardner, you might not have heard the name, but he was over at Division II Augusta. As we know, Augusta this week, very busy with the Masters. He was averaging 23 points per contest, rock solid 3-point shooter. Guy was shooting like 36% from 3, over 50% from the floor. He's heading on over to LaSalle. And I've been saying this a lot on this podcast. If you're a mid-major school and if you're really looking to be able to try to build some inroads, if you're really looking to try to be able to build yourself up, being able to take a shot on some of these guys that are at the non-Division I level or at the junior college level, I think that that's really the way that you're able to build yourself up. That's really the way that you're able to try to be able to beat these teams at their own game. So I think that that is a very good move for them. I absolutely love to see that. AJ George, who he was over at SMU last season. George has had a little bit of a long and winding road. He was over at Long Beach State a few seasons ago where he was rock solid out there in the Big West. He was averaging about 10 points per contest, 4 boards, mid-30s, 3-point shooter. He was part of that team that won the Big West tournament 2 seasons ago. He's heading back on over to the Big West. He's going to be going to meet the Cal State Bakersfield Roadrunners. We shall see what happens with them because with Bakersfield, this is typically a slow and controlled team that prides themselves on defense. Had a little bit of a departure of that this season, so I think that this is going to be a good move for them. He's a 6'6", do-it-all sort of player. Very much should fit the Bakersfield sort of mold. Quincy Ballard, he's going to be stepping on up to Mississippi State. Saw a little bit of a departure with Mississippi State's defense this past season with bringing in Ballard, a guy that at 6'11" last year at Wichita State was solid. 10 points, 2 blocks per contest, very good from the floor. He's able to give you 9 rebounds per game. This is exactly what Chris Jan needs to be able to rebuild that defense. I think that this is a very good move for them. So it appears as though Mississippi State getting back to their roots, and this is a good way of being able to do so. Michigan State stepping into the transfer portal a little bit more. We saw them with guys like Frankie Fiddler and company last offseason. They're picking up Caleb Glenn, a very good 3-point shooter, shot 41% from 3 this last season. He was a part of an FAU team where the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. He was one of the top scorers for the team, 12.5 points, a little bit over 5 boards per contest. Gave you a little bit on defense, obviously, for Atlantic. The defense there wasn't necessarily amazing, but Frankie Fiddler's defense over at Omaha wasn't amazing. He was able to fit in very well with Michigan State. Tom Izzo, he's going to be able to get him to play a little bit deep. 6'7" combo player. I think that this is a really good pickup for Michigan State and one that's very much needed because the one thing that Michigan State did not have last season was 3-point shooting. Obviously, Trey Hallman, he declares for the NBA draft. We are going to see what happens moving forward with some of these other guys. They're also going to be losing Jace Richardson as well. But all in all, I do think that that's a good pickup for Michigan State. I do think that this is a solid pickup as well. Miles Barnstable, he has decided that he's going to be going to Tulsa. Tulsa needs any sort of positivity whatsoever with Barnstable. He was very good over at St. Thomas. St. Thomas was one of the most efficient offenses in all of college basketball, and when it comes to Tulsa, this has not been one of the most efficient offenses in all of college basketball over the last few seasons. He was able to give the team a little bit over 14 points per contest. Not a guy that's going to give you a whole heck of a lot defensively, but this is a guy that is pretty much a walking bucket, a guy that does a nice job. I'll be able to dish it out a little bit as well. Was a little bit more of an off-the-ball guard this past season, shooting about 34.5% from three-point range, a much-needed pickup for Tulsa, so they're able to get themselves a nice volume scorer there. You've got Josiah Legere, he was over at Indiana State this last season. He averaged a little bit over 2 assists per contest. He was a little bit more of a background guy. He's going to be heading on over to Morehead State. Morehead State, I would say that they had a relatively solid year number one, considering all that happened with losing a very good coach in Preston Spradlin under the tutelage of Jonathan Maddox. He was able to do a nice job being able to go 10-10 in conference play. They didn't necessarily have a ton in terms of the backcourt, but they found their three-point shooting towards the back half of the season. Legere should be able to give them a little bit more facilitation, so I do like that pickup for them. I do like this pickup as well. You've got R.J. Johnson deciding that he is going to be going on over to Rhode Island. Johnson was over at Charleston Southern this last season, where he was pretty much the do-it-all guard for this team. As for Charleston Southern, certainly a team that didn't play a lot of defense, and Rhode Island, well, that defense was not great this past season to say the least, but 4.5 assists, 14 points per contest. Johnson, not like an incredible three-point shooter by any stretch of the imagination, but still shot about 33% from three-point range. 6'1", he's a little bit undersized, began his career over at Holy Cross. I do think that this is going to be solid for them, and I do think that that's a nice pickup on that front. We did see a little bit of coaching news that happened on Thursday as well. Big-time shocker, in my opinion. Alan Huss, who I thought that this guy was actually going to be getting a bigger job than what he had. He was over at High Point this last season. He was able to lead the team to the NCAA tournament. He is going to be pretty much a coach in waiting for Greg McDermott, and he is going to be the associate coach for them this upcoming season, which this is just absolutely wild. You don't see this very often because you typically see it with like a mid-major coach. Like we've seen it in the past with someone like a Jeff Linder who was over at Wyoming. He decided to become an assistant over at Texas Tech before he decided to join UTSA. You had Austin Clonch be a coach over at Nichols, and then he decides, we'll join the Alabama staff. Typically you find like a 500 coach that's at a mid-major school. Rodney Terry, when he was over at Fresno State going to Texas, and then ultimately, because of everything that happened at Texas, he does become their head coach. You see those sorts of situations. You typically don't see a coach win 28 plus games, send his team to the NCAA tournament, and then immediately become an assistant. I'm sure that it's a nice pay grade for him, but that was a massive shocker that we saw on Thursday. And we're now seeing some shakeups with regards to the mid-major / low major front as well in terms of SWAC, as it appears as though Patrick Crary, he was over at Florida A&M this last season, and he did a really good job. Crary, he was coaching just 12 months ago over at St. Mary's. And no, I'm not talking about the St. Mary's in California. I'm talking about St. Mary's, the NAIA school out there in the great state of Texas. He did a great job with his Florida A&M team, got them to 14-17, which you might be thinking 14-17, that's not very good. When you consider what Florida A&M had done in the past, it's actually a really, really good coaching job that he did. They went 10-8 within the conference. That was their first winning season within the conference in the last few years, and the last time they had won 14 games in a season, you have to go all the way back to the 2013-14 season, so that's what he was able to do in season number one. He looks like he's going to be going on over to Grambling. It was a case where Florida A&M, they just weren't giving him the contract that he had desired. Grambling, they're going to give him more years, they're going to probably give him a few more bucks, so we're going to see a little bit of coaching movement there, so that means that Florida A&M now has a little bit of a coaching vacancy. I forgot another A&M, Bucky McMillan. He did decide that he was going to be becoming Texas A&M's new basketball coach a few days ago. That's something that I failed to report upon, so shame on me there. I did think that that was a good hire for them, so that means that as of right now, we've got 7 coaching vacancies, according to our good friend over there at Jeff Goodman, who's been doing a great job. I'll be able to track it all. Alcorn State, they've got a vacancy. Now Florida A&M does as well. High Point with everything that we saw yesterday. Lipscomb, UC Riverside, Central Michigan, and Denver. Those are the schools that are currently on the board, and we're certainly going to be following up on this as things go along there. We also did see one of the best junior college transfers in all of college basketball decide where he is going to be going. That would be Antonio Chal. If I'm not mistaken, he did begin his career at the Division I level, and he's going to be heading on over to New Mexico. He was over at Garden City Community College last season, just absolutely dominant. At 6'9", shot 40% from 3, 19.5 points, 7.5 rebounds per game. That is going to be tremendous for them, so I really do like that pickup, and he's going to be able to be an immediate impact guy for them. This is going to be another guy that is going to be able to make an immediate impact as well, as you've got a bit of a boomerang transfer situation with Wesley Yates, who was over at USC this last season, and he was rock solid. 14 points, 2 assists, a steal per contest, shot it pretty well from three-point range, began his career at Washington, and now he's heading back on over to Washington. He was a former top 100 recruit when he was with the Huskies. If I'm not mistaken, he redshirted with Washington, just was unable to get out there on the floor. He was dealing with a little bit of an injury, so he transfers on over to USC, gets some good playing time, and now he's heading back on over to Washington. Washington no longer has to pay Great Osabor $2 million, so I'm thinking that's a little bit of the reasoning for that, but we shall see what happens on that front. But that's certainly going to help out a Washington team that they had, frankly, no backcourt play whatsoever last year. They had great support and absolutely nothing else. So hopefully they do a better job of being able to disperse the wealth and be able to build a little bit of depth. That would be certainly able to help them out, and this is going to be able to help out Western Carolina. Julian Sawarmo, he last year was over at East Carolina. He had his best success when he was playing over at Gardner-Webb, when he was averaging about 12.5 points per contest 2 seasons ago. He played in just 8 games for East Carolina, was unable to just do really anything out there on the floor for them whatsoever, fell out of favor in terms of that coaching staff, what have you. So we'll see what he's going to be able to do, but that's a big-time pickup, and that is going to be a solid one for them. This is going to be a solid pickup as well. Frankie Collins was just very limited this past season, went out after 9 games due to injury when he was over at TCU this last year, and prior to going down with an injury, he was solid for TCU. 2 steals, 4.5 assists, 11 points per contest when he was at Arizona State and fully healthy 2 seasons ago. 2.6 steals per contest. That was a top 10 mark in all of college basketball. 14 points per game. Has always been like a 31% three-point shooter, so not a guy that's necessarily going to light you up from three-point range, but certainly is a nice impact guy for Vanderbilt, a team that they were a little bit weak with regards to their perimeter defense. That was the biggest knock on them. That is going to be able to help them out big time, and I do like what he's able to bring to the table. A solid pickup here for Stone Hill, as they're going to be bringing in Rex Sutherland. He was last year over at New Hampshire, was only able to get out there for 10 games. He was averaging about 6 points, 3 assists per contest, a little bit of a do-it-all sort of guy for the Skyhawks. He's going to be joining Ridvan Tudik. He was a big man over at Maine. As guys that are going to be joining Stone Hill, these are guys that have committed over the last 72 or so hours, so looks like they're starting to be able to build a little bit of something there. Keep in mind that this is a program in Stone Hill that just a few short years ago, they were over at the Division II level. Being able to get this sort of an ad as Sutherland, he was a rock-solid guy that I thought was going to be able to have a good year this past season, just wound up dealing with injuries, what have you, but someone that is able to provide a little bit of upside. And if you take a look at his last previously healthy season, he was a guy that was relatively glued to the bench over there in New Hampshire, but was a part-time starter for them. So being able to bring in a guy like that, that's solid for a mid-major team in that sort of sector. You've got Brian Bungwe, who I still remember a few seasons ago when he was over at Tulsa. He was putting up some big-time numbers. 12 points, 9 rebounds per game. Was a little bit more muted in terms of his production this past season over at McNeese because that team was absolutely locked and loaded this past year. About 4.5 rebounds per game. Not necessarily an explosive offensive player, but a guy that is able to do a nice job in the post at 6'8". He has decided that he is going to be joining Western Kentucky. So Western Kentucky, a bunch that had a little bit of a rough time on the glass, a team that has turned the ball over a little bit too much. They had a big man in Bungwe that should be able to help out a lot of their, shall we say, deficiencies. So I do like what he's able to bring to the table. Additionally, we did see another Division II guy in Tijuan Siani. He was over at Western Washington. He has decided that he's going to be going to Weber State, and again, like this approach when you get these mid-majors, bringing in these guys that they just know how to be able to win. And when you go from the D2 ranks to the D1 ranks, I think that's much easier for a guard rather than a big man. And for Mr. Sayin last season, he was able to give the team 17 points, 4 assists, shot 47% from the field, 40% from three-point range, so absolutely rock solid there. And then we did see Evan Nelson decide that he is going to be transferring on over from Harvard to Arizona. I can't think that this is anything other than a depth add because he was fine over at Harvard this last year for Nelson. About 9 points, a steal and a half, 3 assists per contest, 40% three-point shooter. But Harvard was a below-average Ivy League team, and it feels like teams like Arizona, teams like Duke, they do this every single year. They bring in one guy that was averaging at the mid-major ranks 7 points per game, 8 points per game. They look to them to be a little bit more of those, shall we say, locker room guys, be able to provide a little bit of experience to be able to help out some of these freshmen and sophomores, be able to find their way. I'm thinking that this is the sort of ad that we're getting here, but still regardless, good for Evan Nelson. He's going to be able to finish out his days over at Arizona. I'm sure that because he's a graduate transfer, he was able to get a very nice education over there at Harvard as well. So we're keeping our finger on the pulse of a little bit of everything here on Coast to Coast Hoops, give you all the the information that we are getting here in the offseason and preparing for what is going to be a tremendous 2025-26 season, because the bets that are wondering the season, they are won through great preparation. They're won by being able to take a look at things like we're doing right now here in the offseason. And if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways to be able to throw those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, Larsium, they mean does not matter. So as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. The other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. And then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And a big thanks once again to our good friend Tristan Freeman over at Bustin' Brackets for joining me in the last segment. And I'll be with you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season. So I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.